Marx and Satan, Chapter 2. Against all gods. Satan in Marx's family. When he wrote the works quoted in the last chapter, Marx, a premature genius, was only 18. His life's program had thus already been established. He had no vision of serving mankind, the proletariat, or socialism. He merely wished to bring the world to ruin, to build for himself a throne whose bulwark would be human fear. At that point, correspondence between Karl Marx and his father included some especially cryptic passages. The son writes, quote, "A curtain had fallen, my holy of holies was rent asunder, and new gods had to be installed." Unquote. These words were written on November 10th, 1837, by a young man who had professed Christianity until then. He had earlier declared that Christ was in his heart. Now this is no longer so. Who are the new gods installed in Christ's place? The father replies, quote, "I refrained from insisting on an explanation about a very mysterious matter, although it seemed highly dubious." End quote. What was this mysterious matter? No biographer of Marx has explained these strange sentences. On March 2nd, 1837, Marx's father writes to his son, quote, "Your advancement, the dear hope of seeing your name some day of great repute, and your earthly well-being, are not the only desires of my heart. These are illusions I had a long time, but I can assure you that their fulfillment would not have made me happy. Only if your heart remains pure and beats humanly, and if no demon is able to alienate your heart from better feelings, only then will I be happy." End quote. What made a father suddenly express the fear of demonic influence upon a young son who until then had been a confessed Christian? Was it the poems he received as a present from his son for his 55th birthday? The following quotation is taken from Marx's poem, On Hegel. Quote, "Words I teach all mixed up into a devilish muddle, thus any one may think just what he chooses to think." End quote. Here are also words from another epigram on Hegel. Quote, "Because I discovered the highest, and because I found the deepest through meditation, I am great like a god. I clothe myself in darkness like him." End quote. And in his poem, The Pale Maiden, he writes, quote, "Thus heaven I forfeited, I know it full well. My soul once true to God is chosen for hell." End quote. No commentary is needed. Marx had started out with artistic ambitions. His poems and drama are important in revealing the state of his heart, but having no literary value, they received no recognition. Lack of success in drama gave us a Goebbels, the propaganda minister of the Nazis. In philosophy, a Rosenberg, the purveyor of a German racism. In painting and architecture, a Hitler. Hitler was a poet too. It can be assumed that he never read Marx's poetry, but the resemblance is striking. In his poems, Hitler mentions the same Satanist practices. Quote, "On rough nights, I go sometimes to the oak of Wotan in the still garden, to make a pact with dark forces. The moonlight makes runes appear. Those that were sunbathed during the day become small before the magic formula." End quote. Wotan is the chief god of German heathen mythology. Runes were the symbols used for writing in olden times. Hitler soon abandoned the poetic career, and so did Marx, who exchanged it for a revolutionary career in the name of Satan against a society which had not appreciated his poems. This is conceivably one of the motives for his total rebellion. Being despised as a Jew was perhaps another. 2 years after his father's expressed concern in 1839, the young Marx wrote The Difference Between Democritus and Epicurus's Philosophy of Nature, in the preface to which he aligns himself with the declaration of Aeschylus, "I harbour hatred against all gods." This he qualifies by stating that he is against all gods on earth and in heaven that do not recognize human self-consciousness as the supreme godhead. Marx was an avowed enemy of all gods, a man who had bought his sword from the Prince of Darkness at the price of his soul. He had declared it his aim to draw all mankind into the abyss and to follow them laughing. Could Marx really have bought his sword from Satan? His daughter Eleanor says that Marx told her, and her sisters, many stories when they were children. The one she liked the most was about a certain Hans Rockel. Quote, "The telling of the story lasted months and months because it was a long, long story and never finished. Hans Rockel was a witch who had a shop with toys and many debts. Though he was a witch, he was always in financial need. Therefore he had to sell against his will all his beautiful things, piece after piece, to the devil. Some of these adventures were horrifying and made your hair stand on end." End quote. Is it normal for a father to tell his little children horrifying stories about selling one's dearest treasures to the devil? Robert Payne in his book Marx also recounts the incident in great detail, as told by Eleanor, how unhappy Rockel, the magician, sold the toys with reluctance, holding on to them until the last moment. But since he had made a pact with the devil, there was no escaping it. Marx's biographer continues, quote, "There can be very little doubt that these interminable stories were autobiographical. He had the devil's view of the world and the devil's malignity. Sometimes he seemed to know that he was accomplishing works of evil." End quote. When Marx had finished Ulanem and other early poems in which he wrote about having a pact with the devil, he had no thought of socialism. He even fought against it. He was editor of a German magazine, the Rheinische Zeitung, which, quote, "does not concede even theoretical validity to communist ideas in their present form, let alone desire their practical realization, which it anyway finds impossible. Attempts by masses to carry out communist ideas can be answered by a cannon as soon as they have become dangerous." End quote. Marx will chase God from heaven. After reaching this stage in his thinking, Marx met Moses Hess, the man who played the most important role in his life, the man who led him to embrace the socialist ideal. Hess calls him Dr. Marx, my idol, who will give the last kick to medieval religion and politics. To give a kick to religion was Marx's first aim, not socialism. George Young, another friend of Marx at that time, writes even more clearly in 1841 that Marx will surely chase God from his heaven and will even sue him. Marx calls Christianity one of the most immoral religions. No wonder, for Marx now believed that Christians of ancient times had slaughtered men and eaten their flesh. These, then, were the expectations of those who initiated Marx into the depths of Satanism. There is no support for the view that Marx entertained lofty social ideals about helping mankind, saw religion as a hindrance in fulfilling this ideal, and for this reason embraced an anti-religious attitude. On the contrary, Marx hated any notion of God or gods. He determined to be the man who would kick out God. All this before he had embraced socialism, which was only the bait to entice proletarians and intellectuals to embrace this devilish ideal. Eventually, Marx claims not to even admit the existence of a creator. Incredibly, he maintained that mankind shaped itself. He wrote, quote, "Seeing that for the socialist man, all of so-called world history is nothing other than the creation of man through human work, than the development of nature for man, he has the incontestable proof of his being born from himself. The criticism of religion ends with the teaching that man is the supreme being for man." End quote. When no creator is acknowledged, there is no one to give us commandments, or to whom we are accountable. Marx confirms this by stating, "Communists preach absolutely no morals." When the Soviets in their early years adopted the slogan, "Let us drive out the capitalists from the earth and God from heaven," they were merely fulfilling the legacy of Karl Marx. One of the peculiarities of black magic, as mentioned earlier, is the inversion of names. Inversions in general so permeated Marx's whole manner of thinking that he used them throughout. He answered Proudhon's book, The Philosophy of Misery, with another book entitled The Misery of Philosophy. He also wrote, "We have to use instead of the weapon of criticism, the criticism of weapons." Here are further examples of Marx's use of inversion in his writing. Quote, "Let us see the enigma of the Jew not in his religion, but rather let us see the enigma of his religion in the real Jew. Luther broke the faith in authority because he restored the authority of faith. He changed the priests into laymen because he changed the laymen into priests." End quote. Marx used this technique in many places. He used what could be called typical Satanist style. Shifting gears somewhat, men usually wore beards in Marx's time, but not beards like this, and they did not have long hair. Marx's manner and appearance was characteristic of the disciples of Joanna Southcott, a cultist priestess of an occult sect who claimed to be in contact with the ghost Shiloh. It is strange that some 60 years after her death in 1814, quote, "The Chatham group of Southcottians were joined by a soldier, James White, who, after his period of service in India, returned and took the lead locally, developing further the doctrines of Joanna with a communist tinge." End quote. Marx did not often speak publicly about metaphysics, but we can gather his views from the men with whom he associated. One of his partners in the First International was Mikhail Bakunin, a Russian anarchist who wrote, quote, "The evil one is the satanic revolt against divine authority, revolt in which we see the fecund germ of all human emancipations, the revolution. Socialists recognize each other by the words, 'in the name of the one to whom a great wrong has been done.' Satan is the eternal rebel, the first free thinker, and the emancipator of worlds. He makes man ashamed of his bestial ignorance and obedience. He emancipates him, stamps upon his brow the seal of liberty and humanity, in urging him to disobey and eat of the fruit of knowledge." End quote. Bakunin does more than praise Lucifer. He has a concrete program of revolution, but not one that would free the poor from exploitation. He writes, quote, "In this revolution we will have to awaken the devil in the people, to stir up the basest passions. Our mission is to destroy, not to edify. The passion of destruction is a creative passion." End quote. Marx, along with Bakunin, formed the First International and endorsed this strange program. Marx and Engels said in the Communist Manifesto that the proletarian sees law, morality, and religion as so many bourgeois prejudices behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. Bakunin reveals that Proudhon, another major socialist thinker, and at that time a friend of Karl Marx, also worshipped Satan, quote. Hess had introduced Marx to Proudhon, who wore the same hairstyle typical of the 19th century Satanist sect of Joanna Southcott. Proudhon, in The Philosophy of Misery, declared that God was the prototype for injustice. Quote, "We reach knowledge in spite of him. We reach society in spite of him. Every step forward is a victory in which we overcome the divine." End quote. He exclaims, quote, "Come Satan, slandered by the small and by kings. God is stupidity and cowardice. God is hypocrisy and falsehood. God is tyranny and poverty. God is evil. Where humanity bows before an altar, humanity, the slave of kings and priests, will be condemned. I swear, God, with my hand stretched out toward the heavens, that you are nothing more than the executioner of my reason, the scepter of my conscience." God is essentially anti-civilized, anti-liberal, anti-human. End quote. Proudhon declares God to be evil because man, his creation, is evil. Such thoughts are not original, they are the usual content of sermons delivered in Satanist worship. Marx later quarrelled with Proudhon and wrote a book to refute his philosophy of misery, but Marx contradicted only minor economic doctrines. He had no objection to Proudhon's demonic anti-God rebellion. Heinrich Heine, the renowned German poet, was a third intimate friend of Marx. He too was a Satan fancier. He wrote, quote, "I called the devil, and he came. His face with wonder I must scan. He is not ugly, he is not lame, he is a delightful, charming man." End quote. Marx was a great admirer of Heinrich Heine. Their relationship was warm, hearty. Why did he admire Heine? Perhaps for Satanist thoughts like the following, quote, "I have a desire for a few beautiful trees before my door, and if dear God wishes to make me totally happy, he will give me the joy of seeing 6 or 7 of my enemies hanged on those trees. With a compassionate heart I will forgive them after death all the wrong they have done to me during their life. Yes, we must forgive our enemies, but not before they are hanged. I am not revengeful. I would like to love my enemies, but I cannot love them before taking revenge upon them. Only then my heart opens for them. As long as one has not avenged himself, bitterness remains in the heart." End quote. Would any decent man be an intimate friend of one who thinks like this? But Marx and his entourage thought alike. Lunacharsky, a leading philosopher who was once Minister of Education of the USSR, wrote in Socialism and Religion that Marx set aside all contact with God and instead put Satan in front of marching proletarian columns. It is essential at this point to state emphatically that Marx and his comrades, while being anti-God, were not atheists, as present-day Marxists would claim to be. That is, while they openly denounced and reviled God, they hated a God in whom they believed. They challenged not his existence, but his supremacy. When the revolution broke out in Paris in 1871, The Communard Florens declared, "Our enemy is God. Hatred of God is the beginning of wisdom." Marx greatly praised the communards who openly proclaimed this aim, but what has this got to do with a more equitable distribution of goods or with better social institutions? Such are only the outward trappings for concealing the real aim, the total eradication of God and his worship. Today, we see the evidence of this in such countries as Albania and North Korea, where all churches, mosques, and pagodas have been closed. Marx's devilish poetry. We see this clearly in Marx's poetry, in Invocation of One in Despair and Human Pride. Man's supreme supplication is for his own greatness. If man is doomed to perish through his own greatness, this will be a cosmic catastrophe, but he will die as a godlike being, mourned by demons. Marx's ballad, The Player, records the singer's complaints against a god who neither knows nor respects his art. This emerges from the dark abyss of hell, quote, bedeviling the mind and bewitching the heart, and his dance is the dance of death, end quote. The minstrel draws his sword and throws it into the poet's soul. Art emerging from the dark abyss of hell, bedeviling the mind, this reminds us of the words of the American revolutionary Jerry Rubin in Do It. Quote, "We've combined youth, music, sex, drugs, and rebellion with treason, and that's a combination hard to beat." End quote. In his poem Human Pride, Marx admits that his aim is not to improve the world or to reform or revolutionize it, but simply to ruin it and to enjoy its being ruined. Quote, "With disdain I will throw my gauntlet full in the face of the world and see the collapse of this pygmy giant, whose fall will not stifle my ardour. Then will I wander, godlike and victorious, through the ruins of the world, and, giving my words an active force, I will feel equal to the Creator." End quote. Marx adopted Satanism after intense inner struggle. He ceased writing poems during a period of severe illness, a result of the tempest within his heart. He wrote at the time about his vexation at having to make an idol of a view he detested. He felt sick. The overriding reason for Marx's conversion to communism appears clearly in a letter to his friend George Young to Rouge. It was not the emancipation of the proletariat, nor even the establishing of a better social order. Jung writes, quote, "If Marx, Bruno Bauer, and Feuerbach associate to found a theological political review, God would do well to surround himself with all his angels and indulge in self-pity, for these three will certainly drive him out of heaven." End quote. Were these poems the only expressly Satanist writings of Karl Marx? We do not know because the bulk of his works is kept secret by those who guard his manuscripts. In The Revolted Man, Albert Camus stated that 30 volumes of Marx and Engels have never been published and expressed the presumption that they are not much like what is generally known as Marxism. On reading this, I had one of my secretaries write to the Marx Institute in Moscow, asking if this assertion of the French writer is true. I received a reply. The vice-director, one Professor M. Mechedlov, after saying Camus lied, nevertheless confirmed his allegations. Mechedlov wrote that of a total of 100 volumes, only 13 have appeared. He offered a ridiculous excuse for this. World War II forestalled the printing of the other volumes. The letter was written in 1980, 35 years after the end of the war, and the state publishing house of the Soviet Union surely has sufficient funds. From this letter it is clear that though the Soviet communists have all the manuscripts for 100 volumes, they have chosen to publish only 13. There is no other explanation than that most of Marx's ideas are deliberately being kept secret. Marx's ravaged life. All active Satanists have ravaged personal lives, and this was the case with Marx as well. Arnold Kunzli, in his book Karl Marx, A Psychogram, writes about Marx's life, including the suicide of 2 daughters and a son-in-law. 3 children died of malnutrition. His daughter Laura, married to the socialist Lafargue, also buried 3 of her children. Then she and her husband committed suicide together. Another daughter, Eleanor, decided with her husband to do likewise. She died. He backed out at the last minute. Marx felt no obligation to earn a living for his family, though he could easily have done so through his tremendous knowledge of languages. Instead, he lived by begging from Engels. he had an illegitimate child by his maidservant, Helen de Murth. Later, he attributed the child to Engels, who accepted this comedy. Marx drank heavily. Ryazanov, director of the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow, admits this fact in his book Karl Marx, Man, Thinker, and Revolutionist. Eleanor was Marx's favourite daughter. He called her Tussie, and frequently said, "Tussie is me." She was shattered when she heard about the scandal of illegitimacy from Engels on his deathbed. It was this that led her to suicide. It should be noted that Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, had railed against capitalists having the wives and daughters of their proletarians at their disposal. Such hypocrisy was not out of character for Karl Marx. There was an even darker spot in the life of Marx, the great revolutionary. The German newspaper Reichsruf, January 9th, 1960, published the fact that the Austrian Chancellor Raab donated to Nikita Khrushchev, then director of Soviet Russia, an original letter of Karl Marx. Khrushchev did not enjoy it because it was proof that Marx had been a paid informer of the Austrian police spying on revolutionaries. The letter had been found accidentally in a secret archive. It indicated that Marx, as an informer, reported on his comrades during his exile in London. He received $25 for each bit of information he turned up. His notes were about the revolutionary exiles in London, Paris, and Switzerland. One of those against whom he informed was Rouge, who considered himself an intimate friend of Marx. Cordial letters between the two still exist. Rolf Hoyer describes Marx's ravaged financial life in Genius and Riches. Quote, "While he was a student in Berlin, the son of Papa Marx received 700 thalers a year pocket money." End quote. This was an enormous sum because at the time only 5% of the population had an annual income greater than 300 thalers. During his lifetime, Marx received from Engels some 6 million French francs, according to the Marx Institute. Yet he always lusted after inheritances. While an uncle of his was in agony, Marx wrote, "If the dog dies, I would be out of mischief." To which Engels answers, "I congratulate you for the sickness of the hinderer of an inheritance, and I hope that the catastrophe will happen now." The dog died, and Marx wrote on March the 8th, 1855, quote, "A very happy event. Yesterday we were told about the death of the 90-year-old uncle of my wife. My wife will receive some £100 sterling, even more if the old dog had not left a part of his money to the lady who administered his house." End quote. He did not have any kind of feelings for those who were much nearer to him than his uncle. He was not even on speaking terms with his mother. In December 1863, he wrote to Engels, quote, "2 hours ago, a telegram arrived to say that my mother is dead. Fate needed to take one member of the family. I already had one foot in the grave. Under the circumstances, I am needed more than the old woman. I have to go to Trier about their inheritance." End quote. This was all he had to say at his mother's passing. In addition, the relationship between Marx and his wife was demonstrably poor. She abandoned him twice but returned each time. When she died, he did not even attend her funeral. Always in need of funds, Marx lost much money at the stock exchange where he, the great economist, knew only how to lose. Marx was an intellectual of high caliber, as was Engels, but their correspondence is full of obscenities unusual for their class of society. Foul language abounds, and there is not one letter in which one hears an idealist speaking about his humanist or socialist dream. Since the Satanist sect is highly secret, we have only reports about the possibilities of Marx's connections with it, but his disorderly life is undoubtedly another link in the chain of evidence already considered.